and I've hated this when I've been in house, is when an e-commerce, like a conversion rate company, an agency comes in and says, oh, we have loads of e-commerce experience, we're going to run all these e-commerce tests for you, and you're like, no, that doesn't work. Do you even know anything about my customers? Like, we've had all these conversations, we're spending all this money with you, and you don't know anything about my customers.
Hey, you're tuning in for Interviews with Experimentors. I'm Anna, your host, and today we're speaking with Ellie Hughes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Experimentation interview. And in this episode, we have a great opportunity to learn from someone who is not only at the top of their game, but who's also rewriting the rule book as she goes. And I think this is a great reason to stay and listen to the episode, because there is no better way to learn than standing on the shoulders of giants. And Ellie, you have been awarded Experimenter of the Year, and you're also in top 20 must meet CRO people. So besides that, how would you introduce yourself, and what would be some advice that you would give for someone who is aspiring to be in top 20 CRO people?
Thank you for the amazing intro, Anna. So yes, I'm Ellie. I'm the head of consulting at a company called Eclipse. I just joined Eclipse. Before that, I was working for just over 2 years at a company called And Digital. In both places, I've been doing experimentation, helping clients. But for years before that, I was working in-house. I think in terms of inspiring people to get into the industry, I think it's about starting small. Like, most of the people I know who've ended up in experimentation didn't say when they were like 22, I know what I'll do, I'll go and become a CRO. They might not have even known what a CRO was. So I think it's a case of, you might have come in from multiple routes, but it's about kind of learning as you go, picking up some of these fields. Like, does something about working with data really excite you? Or does working with customers really excite you? Or is there something about getting into the nitty gritty of the engineering and the process, and like, how do we deliver this better and at a higher quality? I think if those kind of questions get you excited, and kind of can get you motivated into actually learning more. I think the other one is, never kind of lose your curiosity. I think a lot of us start off, at university maybe with a lot of curiosity. We're very open-minded. And I think as we get older, maybe we lose that. So I think it's about keeping that openness to failure, keeping that curiosity, like, why does this happen this way? And why is this wrong? And and just kind of continuing to kind of keep learning and keeping that openness of mindset. I think subject matter expertise sometimes matters less than, I've got a question and I want to answer my question, and I'm going to go and keep answering that question. So,
And you have to learn to live with frustration.
yeah, a little bit, yeah. That can be really hard. So, or realizing that, sometimes frustration is an opportunity for learning. Sometimes in our career, we think our career has to be this like straight line. And then when you look back and it hasn't been a straight line, like, why hasn't it been? Well, actually, I went off and did this thing and this taught me this thing. And even though it felt quite frustrating at the time, sometimes those moments in your career and your moments in your current job where you're trying to run experiments, they can feel like they're probably frustrating, but actually they're not really. So,
Yeah, actually, you are in reality learning and growing and going forward. So,
yeah,
we
exactly.
should all be aware of that. Staying in the same topic for a little while, I also want to ask you to give us some tips on, let's say, time organization, or how does your work day look like in terms of, um, dividing the tasks, in terms of creating hypotheses, evaluating tests, um, looking into data, and all of the phases that go into experimentation program.
So I've always been someone who's a bit more on the ideation and data side. So it's been a few years since I actually last did the whole of the end-to-end process of delivering an experiment myself. And I think that speaks more to the fact that I've realized what strengths I need to play to and to allow others to be stronger at something. So I've worked in programs before where I was very, very in the end to end, and I would have to chunk up my time, for different clients between, this is like 10 years ago. Some of the days of the week I was focused on analysis of experiments, and others I was building and developing experiments. I realized early on that engineering, although I was good at it, I wasn't as good as other people. So I thought, why don't I leave successful engineering to other people, let them grow in that space and be really successful at it? And I'm a bit better at explaining to clients, why has this gone wrong? So I would say, in terms of how I chunk up my time, probably, I don't know, 30% to half of my day is either explaining to clients why something's gone wrong, or working out why something's gone wrong, or anticipating something that might go wrong and suggesting something before it goes wrong, so that I'm kind of thinking through what are the things that could happen and what are these edge cases that might happen within the program. I would say the rest of my time is focused on things like, maybe not specifically doing the analysis of certain experiments, but looking at the analysis of the program. Like, how do we look at the number of winners, number of significant or non-significant tests, and kind of, I'll often build like little visualizations or little tools that will help us to um, track kind of, oh, right, this is the velocity of our experiments, this is the pace, this is our number of winners, this is our value of the program. So it's kind of taking what we've taken from analytical insights, which is another area of mine that I like working in, and actually deploying something more end to end to look at the whole program. So I think, as my role, as I've gotten older, as I've gotten more senior, I spend a lot less time actually physically building the tests myself. But I definitely think there are some bits around like ideation. For example, I'd probably spend, depending on the client, because again, I'm talking about this from the client work perspective rather than in-house. When I was in-house, I probably spent at least a day a week just thinking about experiment ideas and ideating. I think now that I'm working with lots of different clients, that's a bit less per week in terms of how I chunk up my time. But if I'm fully running and embedded in a program, I'm working with lots of different product managers trying to help them think up their first experiment or their next experiment that they want to run, and looking at the data and ideating. So I would say that's where I've drifted to in terms of my strengths and how I chunk up my time. I wouldn't say I was that organized, not always. Sometimes when I want to be organized, and sometimes when you have those moments where ideas really strike you that are really good, you sometimes have to bend the rules a little bit and actually go outside of the shape
Right.
of how you're meant to work. But yeah, I think it's about nailing, like, what does client value mean? What does value mean? Can you prioritize your time around what's valuable for you to work on the client? And I'd argue me spending ages writing Jira tickets for someone else is a waste of their time and mine, but someone else would be much better at doing it than me, versus
Right.
actually me
I
thinking
agree.
about, is there a value here that we're missing out on? Is there something that we're not seeing in the data? And my skill really is like doing that holistic synthesis of lots of different types of data and finding that kind of diamond in the rough idea that we wouldn't have otherwise spotted. I think that's
Mm.
where I find my skills apply best. And I think the other area is probably, particularly working with product teams, helping them to capture everything they need to about their experiment before they start working on it. So making sure they've actually got their variables listed correctly. Have they done their thought about their tracking? What extra metrics they might need to track? Um, Using something like this, which I've got pinned up behind me, which is like a canvas that helps them fill in all the information they need to, so that then they don't get to writing the Jira ticket or even building the experiment and go, oh yeah, there's like a whole segment of people we've not included and we should have done. So,
Easy to
but
forget
yeah,
stuff, yeah, like that, which
yeah,
turns out to
exactly.
be paramount. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, that was a really roundabout answer to your question. Sorry.
No, you actually opened up so many topics that I want to touch upon in the interview. You mentioned that you're explaining to clients why something isn't working and
Mm,
what went wrong there. So I want to ask you about, I want to connect this to peaking. I know this might seem not connected at the moment, but I want to see what is the right way to report to clients what is going on with their test while it is running, and we know we
Mm,
shouldn't peak. So
mhm,
how would you tie these two together, and what can you report uh,
mm. I think
during the runtime of a test?
there's almost two difficult client conversations there. One is a macro one and one is a micro one. So the macro one is you've got to the end of the experiment, and whether it's come out as a winner, non-significant or negative, the client's still questioning why the performance of the experiment was what it turned out to be. And then I think there's an earlier conversation which sometimes people avoid having with clients, which is just talking about what peaking is. So by kind of agreeing with them, I think there's always a kind of back and forth in client relationships where you have to agree with that client. This is how frequently we're going to look at the experiment results. The results will be accurate in the following way, and you will get them at this frequency. And I think if you establish that early on in your relationship with the client, they kind of know that's how often they're going to get their results. And so they don't have alternative expectations. You know, it's a little bit like if you reply to emails when you've got your out of office on, you're kind of like
Yeah,
denying the purpose of having an out of office. So,
of
in the same
course.
way, if you send results more often than the pre agreed timeline that you're going to talk to the client about results, you're setting a precedent where you would give daily reporting on an experiment, for example. I worked in house somewhere where we would have our dashboards refreshed daily so we could look at the experiment results reporting daily. But actually, it didn't really help. You know, we'd have product managers come and say, "Oh, there's only 4 days of data in the experiment, and this is happening to the confidence level." And I was like, "This is irrelevant. Just leave it alone. Just stop looking at it." So you know, and one of the things that we would often do, that was when I was in house at Photobox. One of the things we would often do is report experiments. We wouldn't report the result unless it was significant. So we would just say in any
Mhm.
reporting, it's non significant right now, therefore there's no result.
Right, right.
Which did it drives another behavior that's bad, which is making people like aspire to watch the confidence graph go up and up and up, and they hope it's going to be good. But it's less of a bad behavior than looking every day and going, why has it gone up? Why has it gone down? Why has it gone up? Why has it gone down? And then having to explain that actually they're peaking. Um, so yeah, there's a few different coping mechanisms in there, I think, but setting those expectations and then knowing yourself, right, I'm going to look at about a week, unless there's a big error. So you could personally, from a QA perspective, look more often, but just don't tell the client. Monitor it for the first couple of days to make sure that there isn't an issue. If it goes really, right into the red and it's really negative, that is an issue that's worth reporting to the client.
Right,
But
right.
I think otherwise you can secretly, privately peak, but don't tell the client
Mhm.
that you're doing it.
Good tip, good tip.
So yeah. um,
And how would you go about explaining to them what went wrong? And before that, what is the process of evaluating the test and finding the bugs and errors that crept up along the way?
This is Romo Santiago from Experimentation. Every week we share interviews with and conference sessions by our favorite conversion rate optimizers from around the world. So if you like this video, smash that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us a bunch.
I think a lot of people at that point are like, well, who do we blame for the fact that it went wrong? And I think that can be quite
Mm-hmm.
hard. But I think the best thing to do is to actually do your own root cause analysis and say, look, it wasn't actually us. There was another piece of code that went live in a release at the same time as the experiment that we just weren't cognizant of. Clearly, there's a process flow issue here. We need to be connected to that team so that they're cognizant of what we're doing and this won't happen again. And I think experimentation, the process itself of doing it is always iterative. So you always learn things as you go along that could be things that the first time you run a type of experiment coming from a particular traffic source or that plays with a certain page, you discover extra QA scenarios you didn't think you had, or extra people you need to talk to get approvals and sign offs. And maybe that one time you didn't know that that person existed and it's nobody's fault. You just were meant to have involved them in the process. And I think making sure that you and the client are both happy with the fact that the process needs to evolve so that then, in a 6 months or a year's time, you know your process will be better. You're not going to have a perfect process from day one. So I think it's just about kind of being open to that. And then again, setting the client expectations that you will need to change the process, that you'll start with something simple. And then as you find extra edge cases that need to be more complicated, you kind of build them into your process as you go, and creating opportunity for them to always give you feedback as well. I think that's a really important
Right,
part of the
of
process.
course. Of course, of course. And yeah, I think that a lot of it lies in the, I would say, educating the client,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't want to come off as, patronizing or anything. So they definitely,
So
I mean,
I don't think that's
common,
patronizing. I think a lot of clients will turn around and say, "I don't know anything. You're the expert. That's why I've hired you." So yeah, I think you're right. It is about education, and it is. You
yeah,
can even use that word outright. You could be like, "Oh, we're going to enable you. We're going to equip you," but sometimes they outright want training, or they want to know how to do something because they really don't know how to do it. So,
right.
but I think,
And
yeah, you're right.
common ground has to be kind of established so they
Mm,
know not to expect, uplifts from day one that will
mhm.
just keep happening.
Yeah, managing those expectations as well. Like if it's a client side experimentation program versus server side, you often take a little bit longer to get going because you're getting into the code base. I always try and set their expectations that it's at minimum 6 weeks before you'll even get your first experiment live if you're working server side. And I'm not saying that that's high or low, but I'm saying that it's a kind of average compared to other programs that I've worked in. I know other businesses would be faster, but I think when you're first getting started, you don't know what you don't know when you're working with a client's code base. So I think setting that expectation, the first experiment won't go live for like 6 weeks. And then like, oh, well, at minimum, we'll then from run for 3 to 4 weeks, and they're suddenly going, oh, wait, you will have been working with us for like 2 months before we get our first winner. Yes. And then the penny kind of drops a little bit for them. Um, so, yeah, kind of
Yeah, yeah.
challenging them a bit.
That's one of the conversations that needs to happen. But uh, we were also talking about this earlier before the interview, where we talked about how to increase the power of your
Mm.
test, and now we are getting into a more statistical side of it. So you mentioned there are several approaches that you can do, um, and you mentioned one of them, let's say, try small changes, or then on the totally opposite side, try something totally radical. um, what would you say are other approaches in this sense?
So I think there's two things that you can do. There's actually approaching it statistically, which is like, how can I make it really rigorously good, so that then I know I'm definitely going to reach power. I'm going to reach confidence and power on in my experiment result. And then there's also like the what you just mentioned, which is the size of the ideas, the quality of the ideas going in. So that kind of, power helps you correct the miss opportunity rate. And so when you're trying to looking to grow, to make your website better, to grow your customer base, to increase revenue, you especially if you're starting small, you don't want to miss out on those opportunities. So what can you do to increase the size of the ideas that you're testing, so that then actually you're more likely to detect something sooner, so you don't need as much power. So if you imagine a small change might need 4 weeks for you to detect it, a large change might only need 2 weeks for it to be a fully powered experiment that's reached sample size. So if you had two big ideas, you'd get them done in 2 weeks. It's counterintuitive. People think, oh, it's a big idea, so it's harder to build, it will take longer to build and longer to run. It's like, no, actually, because it's so much bigger, it will take less time to run for you to get a result. So actually, then if you've got another idea prepped straight away, it can launch, and you'll get two highly powered experiments that are opportunities for growth, rather than a smaller experiment that will take a lot longer to run. And so I think
Right, right.
that is another client education thing, which is a nightmare. It's really difficult, but I think just I what I do in that instance is I just spend a lot of time with the person to try and help them understand the fact that it's a bit counterintuitive, that when it's a big idea, it's easier to detect, when it's frequentist statistics, and when it's a small idea, it's harder to detect. And I think the question I always get back from clients and product managers when I'm in house equally is, how do I know it's a big idea before I run it? that kind of minimum detectable effect thing. Well, how do I know what the effect size is when I'm sample sizing? And you can go, well, this is the industry best standard. Do you really think your experiment idea is big enough to be bigger or lower than that? Do you think your experiment is big enough to achieve 30% lift? Or something like that, or is it more on the 5% or 2% lift end? And then the client turns around and says, "Well, this is a really small change." I'm like, "Well," and you kind of leave it up to them because you have to give them the tools to think through what's the size of this really. So
Right. Uh, do you explain to them the concept of minimum detectable effect, and do you use it when it comes to evaluating the size of an idea and when it comes to prioritizing?
um, what I tend to do instead, and actually this is one of the other ways in which I use this canvas behind me, is I get the client to think about, given the page you're on, what's the number of unique visitors who are hitting that page? And actually, for some clients, they don't always know that. I was running a workshop a few weeks ago where we were looking at just general sample sizes. We weren't even looking at minimum detectable effect. We weren't even actually sample sizing. We were just looking at the number of unique visitors on certain pages. And they were like, oh, wait, this page that we wanted to launch over here that's in this funnel, it's actually really small. It's only getting like 1 million unique visitors a year or something. Whereas this page over here is getting like 300 million a year or something, much, much bigger in terms of the scale. And sometimes you can lead them on a journey where they discover that themselves and they suddenly realize, oh, right, this thing you've been going on about, I now get it because I need more people to be on the page for me to be able to actually serve this to them. And then once you've kind of got them hooked on, am I showing this to enough people? So I think if you were doing like rice prioritization, that we reach,
Mm,
that size, the number of people who are actually visiting the page. And then after that, I might use effect size if we have enough information. So like when I was at Photobox, we'd been testing for long enough, like for a year and a half of experiments. If someone said to me that they were running a particular experiment on a particular product page on a particular metric, I could go back and look at multiple experiments that have run in the past, even at the same time of year, and say, right, the run rate will be about 4.5 weeks. And it became really, really accurate because we'd built up a list of other experiments that had previously run, and we could say, oh, well, actually, the exact time that took to run on that exact page for that metrics was 36 days. And actually, the experiment
mm,
that we then, when we reran it, it was about 30 days. So we knew we were in the right sort of ballpark with our sample sizing. Whether I exclusively use it for prioritization or not, maybe. I hate the answer, it depends, but I think it depends on the client. I think
right.
if they're more capable of thinking in like impact versus effort, then I might use that instead. Like, is this a big idea rather than minimum detectable effect? So the impact versus the effort, and just get them to kind of focus on like, oh, could we make the idea bigger? Then it will run for less time, and kind of focus on it in that kind of way.
Right.
So, uh, but no, it's a tricky one. I don't think there's a single one size fits all solution. I don't know if you've experienced that, but I think different clients, it's different strokes for different folks, isn't it? So,
Of course, of course. I mean, for some of them, it's just easier to get them on this statistical side of things and explain how the cookie crumbles. But um, I think that some of them just still expect constant uplifts from CRO and not, incremental growth and
mm,
slow, steady changes. Also, few of them really want to experiment in order to learn and get insights.
mm,
It's mostly just for increasing the conversion rate on the website, but
mm,
it definitely takes time, I would say, and
mhm,
experience, and also sharing the learnings with them, in the way that it is explaining to them why a negative result is actually good for you,
mm,
because now you know something that you didn't know before and you can
mhm.
include it in the next test. So
I
in that
always find
sense.
actually the tests we tend to interrogate the most are the negative ones. Because when something's positive, it's like confirmation bias. Like if something's a winner, you're like, yeah, I expected that to win. And then when it's a
You
loser,
just
you
let it
didn't
go.
expect it to win and you end up diving into. There's very few experiments where I've ended up doing a lot of statistical analysis in the results when it was a winner. And I can only think of like 2 or 3 where one of them was because we needed a really rigorous result. So we just needed to be able to report the ROI on the experiment very clearly. And so we did a lot of statistical analysis afterwards. And then the other 2, they were winners where they won for the wrong reason. Like they won at like a global level, but didn't win on another metric that we were expecting them to. So we were confused
Right.
and it drove us to go in a bit deeper. But most of the time, it's those losers where it's like a total conundrum where you're like, why did this lose? It should have won. Like, what? And then you realize that, we're all here to fail and to learn.
Yeah, and then you start looking for reasons to see why it's not working from the technical side and not from
Mm,
the ideation side, or
yeah,
something
exactly.
similar, something along those lines. Yes. But um, can you give me an example of your recent aha moment, so to say? What was it that you recently learned and that you want to share? Um,
Um, you mean from an experiment or from life?
from an experiment, yes.
Experimenting and yeah. Gosh. So having only just started at my new company, I haven't actually personally run my first experiment yet in my new role. But in my previous role, um, I was working with a couple of different clients in like the last sort of 6 months that we were running experiments with them and trying to test out different things we could do. I think actually one of the aha moments was really more on the ideation side, and we found like a group of users we didn't know were having a terrible time, and it sort of triggered the
Mm,
process of coming up with some experiment ideas that were focused on that theme of experimentation. And it was something that the client had kind of not considered before. And the way that we triggered that process was actually we literally took Hotjar verbatim, put it up on a slide with 20 people in the room and 20 people on the call dialed in and said, look, this is what real users have said. And they've said that basically your developers are idiots. Like there was a real user quote that was like, your developers are terrible. They don't know what they're doing. This website experience is horrible. And like people were literally turning around and going, it was it was a shock. It was a bit of a shock to everybody involved. And I just ended up turning to the client and saying, is this stuff you've heard before? Does this? And they were like, we do know this, but actually not everyone knows this. So yeah,
yeah.
it was a nice.
How did you discover that? Was it via a user survey that you just put up during the time of the test, or um,
Um, it
were
was
you
so that
aiming to get? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
no, it's what did we do exactly? So we had, I think, access to the client's like entire Hotjar backlog that had come from like the previous year when they had been running A/B tests and launching features and doing different things on the site. So that particular piece of feedback came from one product area where they'd been running certain things, and so that led to us kind of having that bit of insight that was quite focused on a particular group of users that had a
Yeah.
certain experience. And so it was almost like they were just an underserved group that had not bubbled
Mm,
up in the quantitative data, but had bubbled up in the qualitative data. So getting that pairing between the quant and the qual. And that's often where I'm more of a quant person personally, but I'm often quant person reaching into the qual to try and grab, or what I do is I analyze qualitative data at scale. So they gave us access to 26,000 rows of Hotjar feedback, which I then analyzed using like Net Promoter Score at scale, but also tagging up a lot of the feedback so that we could collate it at scale and go, right, of the stuff where we've had written feedback, so that it's not just a star review, but it's written feedback.
right.
You've had 3,000 reviews that relate to this topic. Most of them are negative. Do you want to do something about that? So I think that's often the way. So
That's where you went in looking for clues. But oh, yeah, kind of moving away from the topic, but definitely negative reviews are gold mines,
Yeah,
because this
absolutely.
is where you can feel the sentiment and get them out, talk to the fears, uncertainties, and doubts on the page. Um, but I also wanted to ask you something about the difference in experimentation when it comes to different types of uh, services and products. So,
Mm,
what are the processes when you are trying to experiment and build tests for typical e-commerce products, and let's say for the services,
like a B2B
let's
SaaS
say,
product or something like that.
exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
SaaS products, or
Um,
as
so
an
I've
example.
had a mixture of working with different clients from lots of different industries, but also when I've been in house, I was in house somewhere that was like a B2B hotel bed bank. And so we could not run classic at scale experiments with our clients. We didn't have the numbers. And then I've also worked places like Photobox where we had the numbers, but the type of um, e-commerce platform it is isn't a normal e-commerce platform because it's a creation experience. You go in and you build something, and an individual customer might spend 7 days building a photo book, or they might spend 7 months. So it's about catching them at the right moment for their conversion. So I think the most important thing is, and I've hated this when I've been in house, is when an e-commerce, like a conversion rate company, an agency comes in and says, "Oh, we have loads of e-commerce experience. We're going to run all these e-commerce tests for you," and you're like, "No, no, that doesn't work. Hey, do you even know anything about my customers? Like we've had all these conversations. We're spending all this money with you, and you don't know anything about my customers." And I can think of a specific example at Photobox where there were some ideas floated that were very e-commercey and actually didn't work for the customer. They were very driven by certain things high up in the funnel that actually isn't the important part of the conversion journey. The important part of the conversion journey is much, much deeper when someone's actually building their photo book and then going to the checkout. As a flip side, when I was working at the B2B bank that I was talking about before, um, we couldn't do classic at scale experiments. But when you're a B2B like SaaS provider, somewhere like, think of a Jira or Atlassian or something, you know who all your customers are, or even, your Optimizely, you know who all your customers are. They
Mhm.
have to sign in order to use your product. Like, there's converting people as in getting them to sign up to use your product, which is probably your primary metric in those cases. But once they're using the product, you know
Yep.
everything about them. You know their size. When I was working at this hotel bed bank, we knew we could actually divvy up into cohorts, groups of clients who were similar to each other, and actually run experiments where they were smaller scale, but we gave half the clients the beta program and half the clients the current program, and then just watch what their conversion rate was like over an extended period of time. And we'd sort of chosen them to be similar size and similar client profile. Their ICP was very similar. And so it was a different approach to experimenting. It was more like a cohort analysis where you watch what happened to these two cohorts over a longer period of time, like a longitudinal study almost. But it led to us being able to have a different type of insight for our experiments. So yeah, I think there's possibilities when you're that smaller B2B company, because you kind of know so much about your customers. It's amazing. You can really get in there and go, oh, that's why they want this feature, and that's why they're struggling to be able to convert, and that sort of thing. So
It's so interesting. Yeah, so interesting to get to know them like that, and then personalize their experience in that
exactly,
way, and then
exactly.
experiment. Yeah. um, and also, I'm also kind of I've been thinking about the lifetime of the customers, let's say when it comes to a service, when they
Mm-hmm.
are signed in, and then there's this period of time when they are just uh, experimenting with the service, and then they have to become the paid customer.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you calculate that time, or kind of predict how long they need before actually convert and become a paid customer?
um
Is there a way to know something like this?
I think, well, I guess it depends on what type of services and what conversion events are important to you. If I think over some clients I work with, there was a client I used to work with who were a bit like Jira, so they offered like a product management product. Um, so with them, they would think about things like what's the number of active users, and are they a paid active user? Are they an inactive, like a non-paid active user, that sort of thing, and having those as their conversion points. If I think back over what we used to do at Photobox, although it's not B2B in the same way, you have these like long conversion life cycles where you have to kind of measure. And I think it's about collecting enough data so that you can say, all right, after about this amount of time, about 80% of people who were first shown the product on, say, day one of the month, by this number of days, most of them will have converted or not. So that's how long that life cycle should be.
Should we make a trade-off between having a very trustworthy experience, a trustworthy test, or should we lower the significance and then not miss out on opportunities that we can find in the testing?
I think um, I think personally, I prefer not to lower the confidence rate. You're already introducing a false discovery rate of like 1 in 10 when you have a 90% confidence level. So I think there's kind of two approaches that I would normally pick. I would either propose slightly bigger ideas. I know we already covered that a little bit, but kind of focusing on maybe doing fewer, more high value tests and allowing them to just run for the amount of time that you need to, especially if it's something really risky. And kind of the second approach is thinking about when is a test not appropriate. So are there times when instead of the test being the right thing to do, is it actually better to do something smaller or different? Or can you combine it with other kinds of research or testing that mean that actually you're not dependent on a single data point? So instead of being focused on, I put everything into this one A B test, are there a kind of 6 types of evidence you could collect at the same time, including maybe an A B test where you prove that it's non significant, maybe because you don't have enough sample, but you have other types of evidence that suggest that you could use those, you could run that experiment. So I think personally, I think you either need to make it a test or not a test. It's either an experiment where you're going to get
Hmm.
statistical rigor for ROI purposes. So if it's an experiment where you really, really need the ROI to be really good, um, then and really clear, and you can report it back to the board, for example, that you made a certain amount of money from an experiment, then yes, have that be that kind of more structured, more rigorous experiment. But if it's more of a sort of learning experiment where I'm trying to work out what to do and make sure something's not a bad change, maybe you're less bothered by statistical significance, and like you don't want to hold yourself to the same set of rigor. Not that I'm saying not use the statistics that are available to you, but just kind of know in the back of your mind, like, what's your shipping criteria? What's your decision you're going to make off the back of the experiment? Is it, I would have shipped this anyway, so I'm just making sure? Or I don't know what customers like, so I'm going to try a few different things and see what resonates and see which ones come back positive and negative. Or the experiment was non-significant and this was something I just needed to be non-significant. There was no big change. There was no, I just needed to make sure it wasn't sort of, it was something didn't have any specific result either way. Or actually, no, I really need this to be a winner. Like, I really need to know really clearly that this was a big winner and how much money it made me and that sort of thing. And just, I almost, so I have a section on here, which is at the bottom here, which is about what's your shipping criteria. So what's your decision that you'll make off the back of the experiment? And I ask product managers to specify before they run the experiment what they'll choose to do when the experiment finishes, so that instead of that kind of decision paralysis when the experiment finishes, we're all sat there going, oh, did we decide to roll this out if it was a winner, or are we going to iterate it, or some other decision that we haven't yet made, sort of thing. So I think it's a bit of a tricky one, but yeah, just having that kind of alignment, basically.
Yeah, and these are all great tips, and it's so um, refreshing to to know that there are so many different types of experiments that and different purposes to run them, so that you can adjust with the situation and, of course, have the team learn about those and also implement the learnings. So this was a great interview, Ellie. Thank you so much. I think I learned a lot this time. So I really want to thank you again, and I hope that you also had a great time. But um,
Yeah, thank you very
thank you
much. And also thanks, Rommel, for creating the platform for both of us to be able to chat like this.
This is Romo Santiago from Experimentation. Every week we share interviews with and conference sessions by our favorite conversion rate optimizers from around the world. So if you like this video, smash that like button and consider subscribing.